It was a cold, crisp morning in the city, the kind of morning that made you wish you could stay under the warm covers a little longer. People were rushing past each other, wrapped in scarves and thick jackets, their breath forming little clouds in the frosty air. The streets were crowded, but there was one person who stood out amidst the crowd. He was a man of quiet strength, someone who seemed to move through the world with purpose, though never drawing unnecessary attention to himself. He wasn't someone who was easily noticed in a crowd, but today, that was about to change. On this particular morning, something unusual happened. A woman, a complete stranger to him, stumbled as she crossed the sidewalk. Her feet caught on a hidden crack in the pavement, sending her into an awkward fall. People around her barely seemed to notice, too busy with their own lives, too absorbed in their phones or their conversations. But not him. In a split second, his instinct took over. Without hesitation, he was by her side, his hand reaching out to steady her. Her eyes met his in that brief moment, and there was a flicker of surprise in them, maybe even a hint of embarrassment. She had clearly not expected anyone to care, let alone step in so quickly to help. But he didn't seem bothered by her surprise. He simply offered a kind smile, the kind of smile that could ease the tension in any situation. He didn't know her, and she didn't know him, but in that moment, the world had slowed down, and all that mattered was making sure she was okay. As he helped her to her feet, she mumbled something under her breath, a hurried thanks, but there was more to her reaction than that. Her eyes were wide, and her face had flushed a deeper shade of red, not from the fall, but from something else. Something was happening here, something that neither of them fully understood just yet. She didn't know why she felt so unsettled, why his presence was making her heart race in a way that wasn't just about the surprise of the fall. There was an unspoken connection between them, something that went beyond the ordinary kindness of a stranger helping another. It was as if the world had conspired to bring them together for this single, fleeting moment. But as quickly as it had happened, the moment passed. She took a step back, muttering another thank you as she straightened her coat and adjusted her bag. He watched her for a second, then, without saying another word, turned to leave, as if the encounter was nothing more than a passing interaction. But for her, the moment lingered. She walked away, but her mind kept drifting back to that man. Why had he helped her so effortlessly? He didn't even seem to notice the cold, the bustle of the street, or the fact that he was helping a complete stranger. It was as though he had seen something in her, something beyond the surface. And she felt. She didn't know how to describe it. Grateful, yes, but also deeply unsettled. It wasn't just the physical act of helping her up, it was the way he had looked at her, the warmth in his eyes that suggested there was more to this brief encounter than what met the eye. As she moved through the rest of her day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The world around her felt slightly different, as though a small but powerful shift had taken place, and she was no longer walking through it in quite the same way. The idea that a stranger, someone she would never see again, could have such an effect on her was both confusing and fascinating. What was it about that simple act of kindness that had left her so disoriented? And then, just as the thought began to settle in her mind, she heard the voice. A soft, familiar voice calling her name. She froze in place. No one else around her seemed to notice, but she recognized it. It was the man who had helped her. The voice was quiet, almost like a whisper in the wind, but it was undeniably him. How could he be here, in the middle of this crowd? Was it a coincidence? Or had he been following her all along? She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but no one was there. Just the usual crowd of people rushing past, oblivious to her confusion. She blinked, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had suddenly gripped her. Was she imagining things? But then, as she turned to continue walking, she saw him again. Not close by, but across the street. Standing there, watching her with the same calm expression he had worn earlier. She quickly glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed him. But no one seemed to be paying him any attention. She turned back to look at him, and for the briefest of moments, their eyes locked again. There it was again, the same strange connection. The same feeling that he was somehow a part of her story, even though they had only shared a handful of seconds together. Now, her mind was racing. What was going on? Why was he still here in her path? As though fate had brought them together once more? She told herself she was imagining things, but her gut told her otherwise. There was something more to this chance encounter, something she couldn't explain. Before she could gather her thoughts, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. She stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She wasn't sure if she should follow him, if she should confront him, or if she should just walk away and chalk it all up to coincidence. But something told her this wasn't over. Something in the way he had looked at her, something in the way their paths had crossed told her that this was only the beginning of a much bigger story. Would she see him again? And if she did, what would happen next? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain, this was no ordinary encounter. And the events that were about to unfold would leave her and perhaps all of us questioning everything we thought we knew about the power of a single act of kindness. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The next few days felt like a blur to her. The city seemed to pulse with energy, the usual hum of life around her, but she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had settled deep inside. Every time she stepped outside, she wondered if she would see him again. The man who had helped her that cold morning. The man whose presence lingered in her mind, like a dream half remembered, a riddle with no answer. It wasn't just about the fall or the kindness. It was something deeper, something she couldn't put into words. She tried to push it out of her mind, tried to go about her daily routine. Work, errands, meetings, everything felt ordinary. But there was always that nagging thought, the question that kept returning, why had he helped her so quickly, so effortlessly? Why had he appeared just when she needed him? And why did it feel like there was more to the story? A week passed, and the world continued to move forward. She met friends for coffee, visited her favorite bookstore, and even managed to take a quiet walk through the park. But all the while, something inside her stirred, a curiosity she couldn't ignore. Was it possible that fate had really played a hand in this? That the timing of everything, of him being there at just that moment, was more than just coincidence? Then, it happened again. She was walking down the same street, the one where their paths had crossed, when she saw him. He wasn't standing on the sidewalk this time. He was sitting at the small CAF on the corner, a cup of coffee in front of him. He wasn't looking at her, but something about his posture, the way he sat there, so still, so calm, caught her attention. It was as though he was waiting for her, even though he didn't know she was there. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, unsure of what to do. Should she approach him? Should she just keep walking? It had only been a brief encounter the first time, and now, here he was again, almost as if he had been placed there on purpose. She took a step toward the CAF, her feet moving almost against her will, but as she got closer, she hesitated. She couldn't understand why this stranger, someone she had only met once, was having such a profound effect on her. Why did it feel like there was something she needed to learn from him? Something important that she couldn't quite grasp? As she stood just outside the CAF, watching him, she noticed something else. He wasn't alone. There was a woman sitting across from him, talking animatedly, laughing as they shared a conversation. It was a casual interaction, nothing out of the ordinary, but the way the man responded caught her attention. There was a kindness in his eyes, a warmth that seemed to make the whole world fade away for a moment. She felt a pang of something, regret, maybe, or even jealousy. It was strange. She didn't even know him. She shouldn't feel anything like that. Yet, she couldn't help it. There was something about him that made her feel seen, understood, even though they had only exchanged a few words. The woman across from him laughed again, and the man smiled in return, his gaze warm and steady. She turned away quickly, her mind racing. Why was she feeling this way? Why was her heart so unsettled by something that had no real explanation? It wasn't like her to get so caught up in a moment. She had always prided herself on being level-headed, on not letting her emotions get the better of her. But this was different. There was something about this man, something she couldn't shake. She kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, hanging in the air like an unanswered question. Days passed, and she tried to move on. She told herself it was just a moment, just a brief interaction that didn't need to be analyzed so deeply. But the more she tried to let go of it, the more the questions piled up. Why did he seem so familiar? Why did he make her feel like she was missing something important? And then, on another routine trip to the grocery store, it happened again. She turned the corner into the aisle, and there he was. Standing by the produce section, picking out vegetables as if nothing was unusual. He was so calm, so effortless in the way he moved through the world. She couldn't help but stop, staring at him for a moment before quickly looking away, embarrassed that she had been caught staring. But he didn't seem to notice. He was focused on what he was doing, and for a moment she allowed herself to just watch him from a distance. His presence was so peaceful, so steady, that it was almost magnetic. She felt an inexplicable pull toward him, like something deep inside her was calling her to go forward, to learn more. This time, she didn't hesitate. She walked toward him, her footsteps quiet on the tiled floor. When she reached him, he glanced up, his eyes meeting hers with the same calm, reassuring look he had given her before. It was like nothing had changed. "Hi," she said, her voice soft but steady. He smiled in return, but there was something different about the smile this time. It wasn't just a polite gesture. It was as though he had been waiting for her to speak, as though he knew exactly who she was. "Hey," he replied, his tone warm but casual. "How've you been?" She blinked, taken aback by the familiarity in his voice. I've been okay," she said slowly, trying to find the right words. "It's just funny seeing you here again. I didn't expect to run into you." He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I didn't expect it either," he said, "but here we are." There was something in the way he said it, something that felt almost too perfect, too planned. But she shook the thought away. It was just coincidence. There was no way this man had been following her. They stood there for a moment, neither saying anything, just watching each other. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't normal either. She could feel the tension building between them, as if they were both waiting for something to happen, something to be revealed. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "how's everything going for you?" She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal. There was something about this man that made her feel like she could open up, like he understood her in a way no one else did. But how could that be? They had barely exchanged a handful of words. "It's fine," she said, forcing a smile. "Just the usual stuff." He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "I know it's hard to believe," he said quietly, "but I have a feeling we're meant to have this conversation. That we're meant to talk." She froze. The words hit her like a wave, knocking the air from her lungs. What was he saying? What did he mean? Before she could respond, he gave her a soft, almost imperceptible smile. "Don't worry," he said. "You'll understand soon. Just trust me." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, frozen in place, her heart racing, her mind reeling. What had just happened? What was he talking about? She wasn't sure, but one thing was certain: everything about this encounter felt far from ordinary. The questions were only growing, and the answers were still nowhere in sight. The encounter at the grocery store left her more shaken than she cared to admit. As she walked home that evening, her mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who was this man, really? What did he mean when he said they were meant to talk? His words replayed in her head like a haunting melody, something she couldn't escape, no matter how hard she tried. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just some strange coincidence. It felt deeper than that, like something bigger was at play. But what? The next few days passed with a lingering unease that settled like a weight on her chest. She couldn't focus. Everything seemed to remind her of that man, his smile, his calm demeanor, the way he had looked at her as if they shared some unspoken understanding. No one else had ever made her feel that way, not even close. Her thoughts kept circling back to that grocery store encounter. She told herself to shake it off. It was just a weird moment. Nothing more. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was something more to this than mere chance. Something was happening, and it was pulling her in like an invisible force. It wasn't just her. Her best friend, someone who had known her for years, started noticing the changes. She wasn't as focused as usual. Her mind wandered during their conversations, her smile a little too forced. One evening, after a long day, her friend invited her over to watch a movie. She hadn't been in the mood for company, but something told her it was exactly what she needed. "Something's going on with you," her friend said softly, setting down the popcorn bowl between them. "You've been acting off lately. You're usually so well present. But not lately. What's going on?" She hesitated, unsure of how to explain. How could she tell her friend that a random stranger had somehow consumed her thoughts? That she couldn't get his face out of her mind? That she felt like she was being drawn towards something that didn't make sense? "I don't know," she finally admitted, shaking her head. I don't know." Her friend gave her a look, one of concern and curiosity. "Are you sure it's not something more? Maybe someone?" The words hit her with a strange force. Someone. It was true. It was him. The man who had appeared out of nowhere to help her, who seemed to be haunting her thoughts. But she couldn't admit that. Not yet. Not to anyone. It felt too bizarre, too unreal to speak aloud. She just nodded, trying to brush it off. "It's nothing. Just overthinking, I guess." Her friend didn't press further, but the look in her eyes lingered. As the evening went on, the laughter and lightheartedness of the movie couldn't shake the weight in her chest. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what it was. And worse, she didn't know if she was ready to find out. The days dragged on, each one feeling more oppressive than the last. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. That man, the stranger, had invaded her thoughts in a way no one else ever had. His image seemed to appear everywhere, in fleeting moments when she wasn't paying attention, in reflections, in the corner of her eye, in the faces of people she passed. It was unsettling, and yet part of her couldn't stop searching for him. On a cold, gray afternoon, as she was walking to the bus stop, she saw him again. This time, he was standing on the corner, as though he had been waiting for her. His gaze locked onto hers the moment she saw him. For a moment she froze, her heart racing in her chest. He didn't move, didn't say a word, but his presence was undeniable. There was an intensity in his eyes, as though he was silently urging her to approach, to take the next step in this strange, unfolding story. Her body felt like it was frozen to the spot, but her legs moved anyway. Before she even realized it, she was walking toward him, as though she was being pulled by some invisible force, like a moth to a flame. When she reached him, the world around them seemed to fade. The bustling city noise, the hurried footsteps of people rushing past, they all disappeared. It was just the two of them, standing there in the middle of the sidewalk. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her heart skip a beat. "Why do you keep appearing?" she asked, her voice trembling more than she'd intended. He didn't answer immediately, instead tilting his head slightly, as though considering the question. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Because I've been waiting for you to ask. Waiting for you to see the bigger picture." The words hung in the air, heavy and mysterious. She swallowed hard, trying to make sense of them. "The bigger picture?" she repeated, her confusion growing. "What are you talking about?" His gaze never wavered, and he took a small step toward her. "It's time for you to understand," he said, his tone almost gentle. "You're not just a random person passing through life. There's a reason you and I met. A reason this is all happening." She shook her head, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. "I don't understand." "What do you mean?" He smiled, but it wasn't the same easy smile from the first time they had met. This one was more knowing, like he was seeing something she couldn't. "You will," he said softly. "Soon you'll understand everything. Just trust me." The words echoed in her mind as he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before she could say another word. She stood there, frozen in place, her mind racing. What did he mean? What did he know that she didn't? Was there really some grand plan, some reason why they had crossed paths? Or was this just another twist of fate, a random encounter that had somehow taken root in her mind? The days that followed felt like a blur. She couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. And the strangest part was, the more she thought about it, the more she began to feel like maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. But how could that be possible? How could this stranger, someone she had never met before, know something so deep about her life? Her friend noticed the change too. The distance in her eyes. The way she seemed to withdraw, as though she were lost in some private world that no one else could enter. She tried to ask her what was going on, but the words caught in her throat every time. How could she explain this? How could she explain the feeling that she was on the cusp of something huge, but still couldn't quite grasp it? The tension was building. She could feel it. Something was coming. Something big. But what it would mean for her, for him, for them remained a mystery, one she wasn't sure she was ready to solve. The days that followed were like a storm quietly gathering in the distance. The unease that had settled into her bones only grew stronger with each passing moment. Her life, once predictable and routine, now felt like a series of strange events, coincidences that didn't quite make sense. Every corner she turned, every interaction, felt like it was leading her towards something. But what? The feeling of being watched, of being drawn into something much larger than herself, was overwhelming. She kept thinking back to that conversation on the street. "You're not just a random person passing through life," he had said. The words haunted her. She was no longer sure of what her life was supposed to be. Each day felt like a puzzle piece slipping out of her grasp, and she couldn't figure out how to put it all together. Her friend, still concerned, continued to press her, but she could never find the right words to explain what was happening. She didn't have the answers, not really. The man, the stranger, had left her with more questions than she could count. Why him? Why now? Why her? But the deeper she went into those thoughts, the more questions arose, and she started to feel like she was being pulled towards something that was both terrifying and inevitable. It wasn't just her thoughts anymore. The city around her seemed to reflect the unease she felt. People seemed different too. Faces blurred together, the hum of conversations felt distant, as though everything had become secondary to this one strange truth she couldn't understand. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being followed, even when she was alone. In every crowd, she imagined him, his calm demeanor, the unspoken connection between them, the certainty in his eyes that she was meant to see something, to understand something, but that he couldn't give her the answers just yet. Her nights were filled with restless sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, his face was there. Sometimes it was a dream. Other times, it was an image that appeared when she least expected it, when she was half awake, or when she glanced into the mirror. It wasn't just his face, though. It was the sense of purpose that seemed to radiate from him, the weight of some kind of destiny hanging between them. And what disturbed her the most was that part of her was starting to believe it, too. Part of her felt like the universe was trying to tell her something, but it had to be decoded. And only he could help her. But no matter how much she searched for answers, there was always that sense of distance between them. She hadn't seen him since that day at the grocery store. Not in person anyway. He had disappeared again, like he was never really there at all. She felt abandoned in the quiet of her own mind, grasping at threads that seemed to slip away just as quickly as she found them. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the city, she received an unexpected message. It was an email, no subject line, just a short sentence that made her heart skip a beat. "Meet me at the old park by the lake at midnight. I'll be waiting." There was no signature, no explanation. Just those words. She didn't need to ask who it was. She knew. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the screen, her mind racing. Midnight. The dead of night. Something about it felt wrong, but the compulsion to go was stronger than the fear. It was as though all the pieces she had been trying to make sense of were suddenly aligning, and this was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment that would answer everything. Or perhaps it would lead her further down the rabbit hole, into a world she wasn't ready to enter. But there was no turning back now. The hours seemed to drag as she prepared herself. She tried to calm her nerves, but each minute that ticked by only heightened her anticipation. She wondered if he had been planning this all along. Maybe it wasn't just a series of random encounters. Maybe this was the way it was meant to unfold. But then again, why had he waited? What had he been waiting for? And why had he chosen her? When the clock finally struck 11, she pulled on her jacket, grabbed her phone, and left the apartment. The streets were eerily quiet, the city's usual bustle muted by the late hour. The path to the park was long, and as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It wasn't a physical presence, she didn't hear footsteps behind her or feel anyone watching, but it was there, in the air around her, the strange sense that something was unfolding just out of her reach. As she neared the park, the first signs of dread crept in. The park was dark, the only light coming from distant street lamps casting long shadows across the path. It felt abandoned, like no one had been here in years. She walked deeper into the park, her breath coming in quiet gasps, her every step echoing in the silence. The lake, normally calm and serene, looked cold and empty under the night sky. And then she saw him. He was standing by the water, looking out across the lake, his back to her. His silhouette was framed by the dim light of the lampposts, and in that moment, he seemed like a figure from a dream, distant and unreachable. She stopped dead in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know whether to approach him or turn and run. The night air felt thick, as though it was pressing against her, weighing her down. Every instinct told her to leave, to get away from this strange, surreal situation. But her legs didn't move. They were frozen in place, as though some invisible force had rooted her to the spot. His voice broke through the silence, calm and even. "You came." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, and for some reason, that made it even more unsettling. How did he know she would come? What did he expect from her? Slowly, she stepped closer, her feet moving against her will, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She wanted answers, needed them, but as she got closer, the dread in her chest intensified. There was something else here, something she wasn't ready for. And it terrified her. When she finally stood next to him by the water, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. His eyes, those same eyes that had haunted her dreams, held something that made her heart race. Something was shifting in the air between them. She could feel it. And then, without warning, he spoke again, his voice a low murmur that sent a chill down her spine. It's time for you to understand the truth. But first, you must know this: everything you thought you knew about your life, about your purpose, has been a lie. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. She didn't know whether she was ready, but she had no choice. The answers she sought were finally within reach, and yet something in the pit of her stomach told her the truth might be more than she could handle. The words hung in the air between them, thick and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. She stood there, staring into his eyes, her mind a whirlpool of confusion and fear. What did he mean by that? Everything she thought she knew had been a lie? The ground beneath her felt unstable, as if the very foundation of her life was shifting, slipping away without warning. He seemed to sense the whirlwind inside her, the frantic questions swirling behind her gaze. He didn't wait for her to speak. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something, a small, black object, flat and rectangular. For a moment, she couldn't make sense of what it was. But then, when he held it out to her, the truth hit her like a wave. It was a phone. A phone that looked old, beaten up, like it had been through more than its fair share of wear and tear. But what struck her the most was the screen. There was something on it. An image. The moment her eyes fell on the picture, her heart seemed to stop. It was a photo. A photo of her. She recognized the scene. It was from that very day at the grocery store. She was in the background, walking down the aisle, her face caught in the frame, frozen in time. But what made her blood run cold was the person standing next to her, the stranger. Only, this wasn't the same man. The face was different, darker, older, more worn, but it was unmistakably him. It wasn't the face she had seen on that fateful day. But this was the man she had just seen by the lake. The man who had spoken to her with such certainty. Her breath hitched in her throat as she tried to process what she was seeing. Before she could ask the question that burned on the tip of her tongue, the man spoke again, his voice cold now, distant. It's not the first time we've met. And it won't be the last. Her body froze, the world around her fading away as his words sunk in. What did he mean? What was he trying to say? How was it possible? Everything she had known, everything she had believed, seemed to be crumbling in front of her eyes. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of the impossible. She stared at the phone in his hand, the picture of her in that moment, and the stranger who looked nothing like the man she thought she knew. Her mind raced. I don't understand, she whispered, barely able to get the words out. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, looking at her with a mixture of sadness and resolve. There are things you can't understand yet. Things that go beyond anything you could imagine. But you will in time. The uncertainty of the moment was suffocating. It was as though she was standing on the edge of some great abyss, unable to see what was beneath, but knowing that she was about to fall, whether she wanted to or not. Why me? She finally managed to ask, her voice shaking. Why am I a part of this? What is happening? He looked at her, his gaze piercing, as though he could see straight through her. Because you're the key, he said simply. You always have been. The words didn't make any sense, but there was a finality in his tone that made her blood run cold. He wasn't offering answers, he was offering a prophecy, a truth that felt far too big for her to comprehend. The whole world felt like it was closing in, and she had no idea what was real anymore. Was she being manipulated? Was this some kind of game? Or was there something bigger at play here, something she couldn't possibly understand yet? He stepped closer, closing the gap between them. She instinctively took a step back, her heart pounding wildly. There was an intensity in his eyes now, an urgency that hadn't been there before. He was no longer the calm, mysterious stranger. He was someone else entirely, someone desperate. And that scared her more than anything. "You have to trust me," he said urgently. "We don't have much time." The air between them crackled with tension. She could feel the weight of his words settling in her chest, pressing against her ribs. Trust him? How could she trust someone who was telling her that her entire life had been a lie? Someone who was offering her a reality that seemed impossible to grasp. But then, just as she opened her mouth to protest, to ask more questions, the sound of footsteps broke through the silence, sharp and urgent. Her head snapped around to see a shadow moving in the distance, a figure emerging from the darkness. At first, she couldn't make out who it was, but as the figure drew closer, her heart skipped a beat. It was a woman. A woman she didn't recognize, but there was something about her, something familiar that she couldn't quite place. The woman's eyes locked onto her with a knowing intensity, and for a split second, she felt like she was staring into a mirror. But that couldn't be possible. The woman stopped several feet away, looking from her to the man, a brief flicker of recognition passing between them. The tension between the three of them was palpable, like a storm on the verge of breaking. Without a word, the woman took a step forward, her gaze never leaving the stranger. "You shouldn't have brought her here," the woman said, her voice low but steady. "Not yet. She's not ready." The stranger's face hardened, his jaw tightening. "You don't get to make that call anymore." The woman shook her head, her lips curling into a faint, almost sad smile. "You have no idea what you're playing with, do you?" The air grew colder. The feeling of dread that had been building within her suddenly escalated, and she took an instinctive step back. What was happening? Who were these people? What was the truth, and why was it so far out of her reach? The man's eyes flicked to her briefly, then back to the woman, his expression unreadable. It's time for her to know. But the woman didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced at her phone, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. And then she said something that stopped time itself. "Not yet. There's something you haven't told her. Something that changes everything." The words hit like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless, unable to process what was being said. What could it possibly be? What could change everything? She turned toward the man, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. But he just stared back at her, a flicker of regret in his eyes. Before she could demand answers, the woman's phone buzzed, and she looked down. Her expression shifted, her eyes widening with something like fear. And that's when the world truly began to unravel. The woman's phone buzzed again, louder this time, cutting through the tension like a razor. She looked down at it, her face draining of color as she read whatever had just appeared on the screen. Her fingers trembled, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. The man beside her noticed, his expression faltering for the first time since they'd met. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice sharp. There was a hint of panic creeping into his words, something raw and unfiltered that hadn't been there before. The woman's gaze flickered to him, then back to the phone. It's happening faster than we thought," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "We need to move now." Her words hung in the air like a dark omen, and for the first time, she didn't seem so certain, so composed. Something was coming, something they weren't prepared for, and whatever it was, it had just crossed a line they weren't ready to cross. The man grabbed her arm, his grip tight and urgent. "We don't have time for this. We need to tell her everything now." The woman shook her head. "You've already said too much. She isn't ready for the truth yet." A low growl of frustration escaped the man's throat, and he turned to face the woman, his eyes narrowing. You think I haven't seen what's happening to her? She's in this whether you like it or not. She deserves to know. The woman's expression softened for just a moment, her eyes briefly flickering with a strange, almost reluctant understanding. You're right. She deserves to know. But it's not just about her anymore. It never was. The tension between them was palpable now. Every word, every glance seemed to carry a weight that could shatter everything. The woman's eyes darted to the lake, then to the distant shadows that surrounded them. The clock is ticking. And if we don't act now. Before she could finish, the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, a low rumble that vibrated through the earth. The trees shuddered, and the night air grew thick with an eerie, unnatural energy. Her heart pounded in her chest as she felt the change in the atmosphere. This wasn't just fear anymore, it was something else. Something much larger, much darker, than anything she could have imagined. The woman turned to her with wide eyes, her voice a strained whisper. You have to make a choice. It's all in your hands now. What do you mean? She asked, her voice cracking. What's happening? What choice? But the woman's face was already fading, as though she was being pulled back into the darkness. Her figure blurred in and out of focus, like a glitch in the world itself. The man reached out to grab her, but his hand passed right through her as if she wasn't even there. The air around them grew thick, suffocating, and then, in a blinding flash of light, everything went silent. When the light faded, they were no longer standing by the lake. The world around them had shifted, warped, like stepping into a completely different reality. The park, the trees, the street lamps, they were all gone. In their place, there was only a vast, empty space that stretched out in all directions, as if they were floating in the void of a universe that had no rules. The man was still beside her, but his eyes were distant, almost hollow. She could feel the weight of his presence beside her, but there was something different about him now, something darker. Something that made the ground beneath her feet feel even more unstable. Where are we? She whispered, her voice small, lost in the emptiness. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around, his gaze calculating, as though he were trying to make sense of their new surroundings. Finally, his eyes landed on her, and there was a flicker of recognition, of something that seemed to break through the fog of uncertainty. This, he said, his voice steady but laced with something she couldn't identify, is where it all ends. Her pulse quickened. Ends? What do you mean? This place, he continued, is where everything begins. And where everything must end. It's where you'll understand the truth. All of it. About me. About you. About everything. Before she could respond, a figure appeared before them, a silhouette emerging from the darkness. At first, it looked like a shadow, vague and shapeless, but as it came closer, it solidified, revealing itself as another person. The figure stepped into the light, and she recognized the woman instantly. The same woman who had been there by the lake, her eyes now hard and determined, her expression unreadable. You're both here now, the woman said, her voice steady. And now, we can't hide from what's coming. The man turned toward her, his jaw tightening. You know what's happening. You know what this place is. The woman nodded, her gaze never leaving him. I do. And I know what you've done. What we've all done. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? What have you done? What's going on? The man took a step closer to her, his eyes softening for the first time. You're the key to everything. You've always been. And you've always been part of this. But the truth is, it's not just your life at stake. It's the world's. Her mind reeled, the weight of his words crashing over her like an avalanche. What do you mean? What's happening to the world? But before he could respond, the woman spoke again, her voice cold. The truth is this. You were never meant to find out. Not like this. But now that you have, there's no going back. The ground beneath them trembled again, this time harder, shaking the very fabric of reality around them. The space they were standing in began to crack, fissures spreading through the emptiness like cracks in glass. She stumbled, her heart racing as the woman's words rang in her ears. There's one more thing you need to know, the woman said, her gaze intense. It's not just your fate. It's his, too. She turned toward the man, her breath catching in her throat. His face was suddenly unfamiliar, as if the person she had known had been replaced by someone else entirely. The truth that had been hanging just out of reach now slammed into her like a freight train. She had been a part of something much bigger than herself. And now, the last piece of the puzzle was falling into place. But the truth wasn't what she had imagined. It was worse. It was more terrifying than anything she had ever feared. And as the world around her began to crumble, she realized there was no escaping it now. As the ground continued to tremble, her legs weakened, and she stumbled forward. The world around them was no longer stable. Everything felt like it was unspooling, unraveling into chaos. The empty space that surrounded them was alive with energy, a force that seemed to pulse with a mind of its own, like an unseen tide pulling them towards something they couldn't comprehend. The woman who had spoken earlier remained unmoved, her eyes fixated on the man, her face unreadable. You've known this entire time, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. It wasn't an accusation, more of a statement, a deep understanding of something that couldn't be ignored. The man's face tightened, his jaw clenched as he looked away from the woman, a flicker of pain crossing his features. I didn't want it to be this way. I never wanted you to find out like this. The woman stepped closer, her gaze softening for just a moment before hardening again. The truth was never meant to be hidden from her. It was always going to come to this. She paused, looking at the woman, then back to the man. But now that she knows, there's no turning back. The weight of those words settled around them like a cloud of inevitability. Her heart raced, her chest tightening as she struggled to catch her breath. She looked between the two, trying to piece together what was happening, trying to make sense of the cryptic words and unsettling tension. Everything felt wrong, out of place, like she was standing on the edge of something monumental. But she couldn't see it, couldn't fully grasp what was happening, no matter how much she tried. You're not telling me everything, she whispered, her voice shaking. What is this place? Who are you really? What's going to happen to me? The man turned his gaze to her then, his eyes filled with sorrow, something that seemed to pierce straight through her. I've kept the truth from you because it wasn't time, but now it has to be said. He hesitated for a moment, collecting his thoughts, as though he was deciding whether to say the words that had been hanging in the air between them. She could see the battle in his eyes, the conflict. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. You've been living in a world that isn't what you think it is. We all have. There are things that exist beyond our understanding, things that shape the very fabric of reality. And you, he pointed to her, you are more than just a part of this world. You're a link to something much bigger. Something that has been hidden from you for your entire life. The ground beneath their feet shook again, and this time, the cracks in the air seemed to widen, the very space itself beginning to tear. Her breath caught in her throat, panic rising as the world around them began to fragment. Was this it? Was this the moment everything would collapse, just like the man had warned? You need to choose, the woman said suddenly, her voice sharp, pulling her focus away from the chaos around them. You can either stay here, in this world you know, and watch it all disappear, or you can embrace the truth and face what's to come. The words seemed to echo in the space, amplifying, resonating deep within her. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but no words came. Instead, A new feeling crept up inside her, a sense of clarity, of knowing that this wasn't just some twisted nightmare. It was real. Everything she had felt, everything that had been pushing against her this moment was inevitable. She could feel it in her bones. "What do you mean, embrace the truth?" Her voice broke, but there was no going back now. "What is the truth?" The man took a step toward her, his face grave. "The truth is that you were never meant to live a normal life. You were always a part of something bigger, something that has been influencing the course of history for generations. You're connected to something ancient. And now, that connection is about to be unlocked." For a moment, silence fell over them. The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating. She could feel her heart racing, her mind spinning, but she couldn't tear herself away from him, from the truth that was finally being laid bare before her. "You've known all along, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew what was coming." The man nodded slowly. "I've known for a long time. But I couldn't tell you until now. Until the time was right. And now, it's time for you to decide." The woman stepped forward again, her gaze unwavering. "This is your moment. You can change everything, or you can let it all slip away." The air around them crackled with energy, a palpable force that seemed to draw them all toward the center of the storm. The cracks in the reality around them widened, and a bright light began to emerge from the rift. It grew, spreading like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. She felt it, deep in her chest, the pull, the draw toward that light. It was calling her. But to go toward it would mean stepping into the unknown. The man's voice was steady, his words almost lost in the chaos of the rift. "You have to decide now. If you stay, everything will fade. If you go, everything will change. But you'll never be the same." The light surged, now engulfing everything around them. It was warm, comforting, and terrifying all at once. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, her mind racing. The world she knew was crumbling before her eyes, and there was no turning back now. But what would happen if she stepped into the light? Could she handle the truth? Could she live with what she would become? The woman's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and commanding. "Make your choice." In that moment, the answer became clear. She could feel it in every fiber of her being. She couldn't go back. She couldn't live in ignorance any longer. The truth was her destiny, whether she was ready for it or not. There was no escaping what she was meant to do, what she was meant to become. She was the key to everything. To the future, to the past, and to the fate of everyone around her. With one final glance at the man, whose face was filled with both fear and hope, she stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the light, everything changed. The world around them shifted, the rift closing behind her as she was pulled into the light. Her vision blurred, her body weightless, and for a moment she felt as though she was floating in time itself. It was overwhelming, the rush of memories, the flashes of events that had yet to happen, the realization of everything she had been meant for. And then, as quickly as it had started, the light faded, and the world around her stabilized. She stood in a place she didn't recognize, a vast, open landscape stretching as far as the eye could see. The air was different here, sharp and clean, and she could feel the pulse of something ancient beneath her feet. She wasn't alone. Standing before her was the woman, her eyes filled with a knowing gaze. Beside her stood the man, his expression unreadable but determined. They were both waiting, as though they had been expecting her. The choice had been made. The path was set. There was no going back. "You've crossed over," the woman said softly. "Now you can begin to understand." She took a step forward, her heart steadying as the reality of her decision settled in. She had chosen to embrace the truth, and now she would face the consequences. But she knew one thing for sure: whatever lay ahead, she would face it with strength. The journey had just begun, and there was no telling where it would lead. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again.